Welcome to the Real Clear Politics Takeaway for Friday, August 27th. I'm Andrew Walworth. More than 100 people were killed in a coordinated suicide bombing outside the Kabul airport on Thursday, including at least 13 U.S. service members and 90 Afghan civilians, making it the deadliest day for the U.S. military in Afghanistan since 2011. The terrorist group ISIS-K claimed responsibility, and President Biden has ordered the Pentagon to, quote, develop operational plans to strike ISIS-K assets, leadership, and facilities. Meanwhile, the evacuation of Afghanistan continues, and RCP's Phil Wegman reports that in the 24 hours following the attack, approximately 12,500 people were flown out of the country on U.S. military and coalition flights. Afghanistan has developed into a tragedy for the Afghan people, a nightmare for the U.S. military, and a political disaster for the Biden White House. Here to sort through the events of the week and the implications for the future are Tom Bevan, RealClearPolitics co-founder and president, Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, and Thom Shanker, former Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times, who covered the Afghan war extensively, including being embedded with the U.S. Special Forces in Kandahar. Tom also covered the wars in former Yugoslavia, where he was the first reporter to uncover and write about the Serb campaign of systemic mass rape of Muslim women, and he is currently the director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University. Tom Bevan, tragic day with so many implications, but let's start at the White House. It's always a hard day for a president when American lives are lost to terrorism, but this was something that even his closest advisors seem to have, if not predicted, at least anticipated. What do you make of the president's response so far?
Well, I mean, I thought his remarks last night were fine. Folks on the right are criticizing him for saying that he didn't seem strong enough, he rambled, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I thought it was fine. Look, he's in a tough position. And this one really is on him. His decisions that have led to whether they expected this to happen or not. And I challenged the White House on that because he didn't tell us this was going to happen in advance. He did not prepare the American people for the chaos that was going to ensue. So he's in a tough spot, but this one's really on him. And so I do think it was obviously a bad day for America. Whenever you lose that many troops, a sad day, tragic. But this story is far from over. I mean, we have many, many days to go before the deadline. Many, many days after that, we'll be reading stories about Americans who are trapped in Afghanistan. So as far as the political fallout of this is concerned, I think it's the storm that the Biden administration is trying to fight through right now is far from over.
Well, Thom Shanker, I want to ask you about the situation on the ground itself, especially because you've been there, you've been through these checkpoints. What do you make of how that actually happened? I mean, what do you think happened?
No, thanks, Andy. And it's a real honor to be joining you today. I mean, checkpoints in a combat zone are about the scariest place that you can be, especially when the security is not being handled by a state power. It's in transition. The Taliban, of course, own the country, but it's very unclear how disciplined the various checkpoints are leading to the airport. President Biden last night used the term heroes to describe the 12 Marines and the Navy corpsmen who lost their lives. And that's the truth, because the suicide bomber, whether it was a man or a woman, had passed through some number of checkpoints outside the airport run by the Taliban and whatever's left of security forces. What these Marines were doing was a physical, hands-on, final search before people are let into the airport. Female Marines are checking the women. Male Marines are checking the men. And clearly the ISIS suicide bomber, whether a man or a woman, realized that's as far as they were going to get. And he or she detonated the vest just 5 feet from where the Marines were the last line of safety. Had those Marines not been there, had it only been Taliban and local security, that suicide bomber could have gotten onto the airport grounds, could have gotten onto a C-17, blown up an aircraft with hundreds of people. So these people truly lost their lives as heroes.
Tom, if I could ask you, jump in here and ask a question. I mean, one of the things that people are trying to figure out is how did the Taliban miss this, especially when you consider what appears to be the strength of the blast. I mean, the amount of explosives that someone must have had. So the idea, were they colluding? Biden said last night there was no evidence of collusion. But I mean, do you think this is something the Taliban checkpoints could have missed? Or is it something that perhaps they let through on purpose?
Tom, it's a great question. We don't have enough information yet. Clearly, the forensic scientists are on the ground. The military, unfortunately, over the past 20 years has become expert at finding pieces of bodies and explosives and shrapnel. Just a couple quick thoughts. If the ISIS-K suicide bomber was a woman, it's very possible the Taliban, as we know, don't have any women fighters among them. And in their culture, it's hard to imagine a Taliban security guard at a checkpoint putting hands on a woman or even a man dressed as a woman. And we've known from years of terrorist studies that al-Qaeda male operatives often traveled dressed as women for this exact reason. So could it have been collusion? Always a possibility. I think it was just a rather porous and chaotic security. And I'll be curious to hear if there's any evidence down the road that it was someone, either a woman or a male fighter dressed as a woman.
Will we even be able to do that kind of forensic analysis? I mean, if we're out on the 31st, will we ever get answers?
It's very challenging, Andy. You're right. That timeline. I mean, they're sadly probably going over that fatality site with plastic baggies right now, trying to gather evidence. But you're so right. The real priority is getting out Americans and Afghan allies, and perhaps the post-blast forensic will be a second priority.
So, Carl, what about this August 31st deadline? Is that going to hold, do you think, at this point?
The president yesterday was pretty clear that it was. He has not wavered on that. And it's hard to ever imagine what terrorists are doing. I mean, these Islamic State terrorists who killed all these people yesterday, not just Marines, but women and children, families. What are they doing? That's a humanitarian effort there, and Americans are leaving. So a sane person has trouble even figuring out what they're doing. But it seems to me one of the things they're doing is they want to make sure the Americans really do leave on the 31st. And, we lost many more Marines, 220 of them, and I think 28 other servicemen in the barracks bombing in Beirut in 1983. And the United States did leave. Now, that was an Iranian terrorist. But I didn't hear anybody yesterday saying we should delay it. I didn't hear the president say that.
You heard no one at the White House, but there's certainly voices thinking that this August 31st deadline should be extended.
No, I'm talking about in the administration, Andy. I just didn't. I mean, if any of you heard that or hinted that, I didn't.
So, Thom, Bevan, the estimates are, I guess, that there will be about 1,000 Americans left in country after we withdraw. Are these people then effectively hostages, even if they're not taken prisoner? In terms of our relations with the Taliban, have we not handed them basically a hostage situation?
Yeah, to a degree. But as Biden said last night, and the administration has been saying, I mean, there are plenty, and we don't know the numbers. So, whether it's 20 or 200 of people who don't want to leave for whatever reason. They have extended family. They're working on, projects they want to complete, whatever.
A lot of them have dual citizenship, Tom.
Dual citizenship. You're right. There's all sorts of various situations. And so if people don't want to leave, we can't force them to leave, and they would then be there not as hostages, but I'm sure we've heard other reports about people who are trying to get out of Afghanistan, but they may not be near Kabul, and they're trying to figure out how to make their way across the country, and it's just too perilous for whatever reason. So, I mean, we need to get those people out. We need to and it's a very difficult job, obviously, to locate them and then coordinate whether that's going to be special missions outside of the city or whatever the case may be. And that's probably going to take well past the August 31st deadline as we continue to find them and make arrangements to get them out. God willing, it happens without any more loss of life, either civilian or military, but it's going to continue to be a pretty dicey operation, even as we pull the rest of our troops out on the 31st, which I think is exactly what the Biden administration, as he said last night, is planning on doing.
So, Thom Shanker, I want to draw on your experience there in Afghanistan. 2 points. One, to pick up on what Thom is saying, is that this idea that we're going to maybe have to extract Americans after August 31st. And secondly, the president said, and this is his quote, speaking to the terrorist attack yesterday, he said, "We will not forgive, we will not forget, we will hunt you down and make you pay." Given the withdrawal, is this still a credible threat? I mean, can we do that?
I mean, it's a terrific question. General McKenzie, the commander of Central Command, said that, they're already looking, they're already drawing up plans. I mean, President Biden wanted to end the forever wars. And at a strategic level, there's a lot of agreement. He didn't want to pass Afghanistan on to a fifth president. But clearly, America cannot forget about Afghanistan. In this chaos, we're seeing ISIS-K rebuilding. Al-Qaeda could come back. And to be sure, the long reach of American forces can go anywhere in the world. But it may very well be that under this president who ordered the full withdrawal, there will also be an order to launch raids or attacks back into Afghanistan, even after he said, we are done there. And the real challenge in this environment is, the American military and American intelligence has lost almost all of its intelligence capability on the ground. The network of people, the informants, the ability to walk the streets and listen. To be sure, the U.S. military and the intelligence folks have great electronic intercepts, and Afghanistan's very much now a cell phone society, as it wasn't before. But anybody in the business will tell you there's no way to replace human assets on the ground, and that will be very, very difficult right now.
Carl, what do you think happens to American public opinion about this as this war doesn't really wind down, or at least we get our troops out, but we're still left with sort of the lingering after effects of even this withdrawal, but more importantly, the kinds of events that Thom is sort of anticipating there?
Well, I've been wondering about that. If a president loses his credibility or people just tune him out, it's hard to get that back. That happened to George W. Bush late in his presidency. It happened to, other presidents, Jimmy Carter, Herbert Hoover. Joe Biden's not at that point yet, but the polling leading up to Afghanistan, it seemed to say Americans were tired of that and wanted to get out and didn't see why we still had to be there. That polling was superficial. The Brookings Institution did some more in-depth polling, and if you sort of asked questions about people and indicated what might happen if a full withdrawal, the opinion was pretty close. I mean, people weren't sure what to do there. I thought President Biden, who hasn't wavered from this at all. And remember, this is Donald Trump's policy. He's the one who negotiated with the Taliban. He got the date. The date was earlier than August 31st. It was in May originally. It's unseemly that Trump is, crowing about this or chortling about it, because this was his policy. Biden never wavered from it. And I thought yesterday, guys, I'd be interested in what you all think. I thought he gave his best explanation so far, what he was thinking. He said, we went there for two reasons. We went there because the attacks came from that country of 9/11 and because Osama bin Laden was living there. And he said if he had been in, say, Yemen, which was logical because Osama bin Laden had some history in Yemen and some ancestors there, would we have gone into Afghanistan if the attacks of 9/11? Would we still be there 20 years later? Pretty good point. And it brought home, in a way he hadn't done yet, that the reason you're staying there now is purely nation building and because you already have a footprint there. But there'd be no end to it otherwise. I thought yesterday for the first time he really explained it, and he didn't sound like he was, again, I keep saying this, he didn't sound like he was having any second thoughts. Now, will the American public agree with him or not? That remains to be seen. But he doesn't seem far off from the majority of opinion in the country on this, to me.
I'd like to ask Carl a question with your permission. I'm so glad that you raised the Beirut bombing analogy earlier, and I read your great piece on Real Clear Online this morning, and that historical context is so important. The 12 Marines and Navy corpsmen who died yesterday is a tragedy for each of them, their families, our nation. But on Reagan's watch as commander-in-chief, as you said, he lost 230 and several dozen wounded. And when you read, the legacy of Ronald Reagan, that's barely an asterisk now. And what people remember is the end of the Cold War and everything else.
Yes, well, it's an asterisk in part because he did end the Cold War.
Well, but
no. But
hold it. To Thom Shanker's point, let me just address it really quick, and I'll step away. Yes, it's not talked about a lot now, but Reagan himself, he said it was the saddest day of his presidency and perhaps the saddest day of his life. He never really got over it. He never forgot about those people, and the Marines haven't forgot about it. Americans have short memories these days, and maybe 12 people isn't, but I But again, the difference to me is that Reagan's credibility wasn't all, he'd sort of agreed, he'd acquiesced to this deployment reluctantly. The mission wasn't clear what they were going to do there. Lebanon was descending into civil war. This was a multinational force. It wasn't a UN force, but the UN had sort of agreed to this. So Reagan wasn't really identified with that policy in a way that Biden's identified with this policy. And I suspect that's the difference, one of the differences.
That is the difference. He's taken what has been a broadly popular policy, right, among Democrats and Republicans, and he's bungled the execution of it. And that's the problem. I mean, even Jimmy Carter, you look at Carter, he's forever known for the hostage crisis as a stain on his presidency. And they had this, failed mission, which was a dangerous mission that went south. This is more, and again, when Biden explains his reason for getting out of Afghanistan, I think most people understand it, agree with it. What they don't understand is, why did you pull the military out first? Why did you give up Bagram Air Base and all of our assets? I mean, how did we end up in this situation? And he says his answer to that is, well, I just listened to all my generals. And that's what they said, and I did what they said. I don't know. And I've heard people questioning this. And Thom Shanker, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. He said last night there was unanimity among his military leaders, from the Joint Chiefs all the way through CENTCOM, et cetera, that giving up Bagram was the right decision. And I don't know if I believe that. Part of me is like, well, if there was unanimity, that's a problem. Shouldn't there be some dissent? Shouldn't there be some dissenting voices that are saying to him, hey, maybe we don't want to do it this way? However the decision was made, though, it was Biden's decision to do it this way. And the casualties and the deaths are a result of that. And that's why I think this is something that is going to stick with him, even if 4 years from now, the administration is saying, we got out of Afghanistan. That was our policy, and we accomplished that. But this is one that I think isn't going to go away.
I mean, I would say, Tom, to your good question, unanimity of opinion exists only in a cemetery. I cannot
right.
I cannot imagine that the American military, even colonels and above, not all 1.3 million, agreed with every step the president has taken. That's just natural inside a large force that is uniform only in what it wears and not in what it thinks. And it's a bit of a cliche, and I'll use the polite word for it, but America always fouls up the end game. We've seen that over and over again. And as Andy Walworth said earlier, a lot of people agree with Biden's overall goal to get out of Afghanistan, but they have fouled up the end game. There's no doubt about that. And it would seem when the history is written, it will be interesting because Biden is surrounded by some very committed, very patriotic, very smart senior advisors, but they've been with Biden for a very long time. Obama, rightly or wrongly, assembled a team of rivals. Biden has assembled a team of fans, advocates, friends. And so perhaps there was a groupthink because they knew what the boss has wanted to do for so long.
Well, I want to turn just to sort of the international implications of this. Today, Biden is scheduled to meet with the new prime minister of Israel. One of the things they're certainly going to be talking about is the Iran nuclear deal. Thom Shanker, I'll just go to you again. What do you think the implications are for those conversations in light of the withdrawal, and especially in light of what's happened in the last 24 hours?
Sure. I mean, I'll put on my journalist hat and sort of tell you both sides. I think the Israelis are very concerned that Biden will enter into a nuclear deal with Iran that Israel feels is not in its best interests. And they probably see Biden now seeking any kind of diplomatic win. And that really, really bothers them. The other side of the argument, though, is over time, if Biden's bet pays off, that getting out of Afghanistan allows the U.S. to devote national security dollars and personnel and mental bandwidth to more important challenges, then Iran might be dealt with in a stronger manner, as well as the rising China threat. We just don't know yet, Andy.
Carl, do you buy that? This idea, and this is a popular talking point, if nothing else. Not that I'm accusing Tom of using talking point.
I buy anything Thom Shanker says.
I know.
He's my guy.
But I think this idea that you somehow devote less resources to Afghanistan, that means you can devote more resources elsewhere. That assumes that Afghanistan sort of somehow disappears as a foreign policy problem, and that it doesn't have sort of a ripple effect that requires us to do things in places like Africa, in South America, even on the southern border that we might not have to have done otherwise. In other words, it's kind of a zero-sum approach to foreign policy. Does the world really work that way?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I was wondering what you're wondering while I was listening to the president speak on Thursday, and he made this point. And to return to his analogy about if this attack had happened in Yemen, will we be in Yemen? Well, but it didn't happen in Yemen. It happened in Afghanistan. And when it happened, the United States people, if you're old enough, if you're over, this was 20 years ago, but if you're in your 20s or older and you remember, the United States demanded that the Taliban turn over Osama bin Laden and his top lieutenants. That was our position. There were people in the government who thought they would. It turned out the Taliban was closer to a wholly owned subsidiary of al-Qaeda by that point than they were an independent country. They've since been their original sponsor, the Pakistani intelligence service, is now maybe running them again. Bin Laden's been dead. I don't know about the remnants of al-Qaeda. Most of the commanders were killed. But it does seem that Afghanistan is a very fertile place for terrorism to take root. And abandoning that country now with the idea you might have to go back, that's logistically doesn't seem very sound. The president's been saying that, though. And look, we have spent a lot of time there and a lot of money and a lot of lives. So, this argument, enough's enough. We'll see if that carries the day. But I wouldn't be surprised if the United States has to go back in there, hopefully not an invasion take over the whole country again, but back in there to do some of the things that President Biden was promising yesterday to get these guys.
Carl, you're a little more equivocal and open-minded than you were last week when you were ganging up on me over and the three of you were pounding it, not Thom Shanker, but our other guest. Anyway.
Listen, this thing that happened yesterday, it's the worst case. I mean, it's what we've been fearing. And every American, whatever your partisan views are, and I'm not a strongly partisan person, but should be worried about the people who are over there and worried about the people who have to live there.
I absolutely buy the argument that if we have, we pull out of Afghanistan, those troops, those resources, that bandwidth, those dollars, all of that can be reallocated into different threats around the world. The problem with it is, I think the way that this has been executed has been, the administration has looked incompetent, inept, weak in some instances. And that just, I think the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and, the North Koreans, all of our global enemies or antagonists are looking at this and thinking, maybe now's the time that we need to up our game or, put some pressure on, start applying pressure in certain places. And so, while we may recover some resources by not being in Afghanistan, the demands that are going to be produced by aggression by some of these countries might be, it might end up being a net loss for us in terms of the amount of effort we're going to have to expend in other places.
Thom Shanker, what do you think?
Well, to be sure, I think that, initially, China, Russia come out winners here. But I do think we need to look sort of midterm and long term. What happens to Russia when you have a radical Islamic Afghanistan along its southern periphery? You all know the map of Afghanistan. There's a finger of Afghanistan that goes right into China where its Muslim minority lives. And so China now has a radical Islamic country on its border and in an area where its own Islamic minority is living. For 20 years, the U.S. has provided all the security for Chinese investment in Afghanistan. Well, they now have to pay for that. So again, I agree with both Tom and Carl that initially the U.S. is weakened by this by far, but I do think there are mid and long-term risks for Russia and China as well that we need to consider.
Carl, I want to talk just for a second about the Republican Party in all this. Biden has reminded us many times that he inherited this policy from Donald Trump. There is that Trump wing of the party that is against these forever wars, as they call them. But some see, at least a glimmer of a resurgence of some sort of neo-Reaganite commitment to global engagement that may be forced by the events of this week. Is that debate going to happen within the Republican Party? And is it worth having?
Well, in some ways, Donald Trump was a classic isolationist, and they've existed in both parties going back more than 100 years. I mean, to the late 1800s. And, America First It's an unfortunate phrase because to use, because in the 30s it was used by Nazi sympathizers and apologists in this country. But most Americans, a majority of Americans, and Tom Bevan keeps pointing this every week, this idea that we're supposed to be the world's policeman is not a popular idea in America. It's a problematic idea. But at the same time, Americans understand that some of these problems, if somebody's got to do it, and we're the only ones who can. And Americans have, I think, a pretty sophisticated idea. They got two ideas in their head at the same time is how I put it. We don't want to be doing it, but sometimes we have to do it. In terms of the Republican Party, I'm curious where this debate will go. In the last 5 years, when you're, calling people, fat, or calling their wives ugly, or saying implying they have small penises, the way Trump did when he was running, it's hard to have a high level philosophical debate about America's role in the world. But, Mike Gerson, who was in George W. Bush's White House, wrote a book. I think it's called Heroic Conservatism. And it's neocon became kind of a slur, but it's this idea that America has to project American power in the world, but primarily for the purpose of human rights, and to further democracy and human rights. And this is not much different than what Jimmy Carter believed. And so when you have, you always had this rough consensus among elites and among the establishment that America had to play this role in the world. And each party's gone through times, the Democrats after Vietnam, the Republicans after Iraq, where they've retreated from that. The next standard bearer for the Republican Party in 2024, his or her views on that will have to be explained during the campaign, and they'll have to have the Republican base with them. And I don't know who that person's going to be, and I don't know where the Republican base is going to be, but I think this is the debate to watch in the next 3 years.
Thom Shanker?
Well, in the debate about isolationism or internationalism, I would just always in the future add another word, which is hubris versus humility. I mean, I think you can be internationalist, but have a little humility about what we can do. I think if there's one lesson for the past 20 years in Afghanistan, is that we went in with just incredible, egregious hubris that we could rebuild a pre-medieval society that had never had a central government or a unified army into something that looked like, the United States. And, trillions of dollars and thousands of lives later, we realized, gosh, we should have been a little bit more humble. So to Carl's very good point about balancing the two, I think whether it's international or whether it's isolationist, the U.S. should be well aware of its limits.
Tom Bevan, I somehow managed to get through this without asking you about the polls, because it has been an interesting week in terms of polls. And when you look at these polls, are you seeing anything that's going to give you any indication about what's going to happen in the midterms?
Well, we had a round of polls out early in the week, which showed Biden's approval rating suffering, right? The one that got the most attention was the Suffolk USA Today poll that had his approval rating sinking to 41%, but a couple others had him, mid 40s, upper 40s, but down. And his handling of Afghanistan in particular was 25-26%. So, and yet you still had 55-60% of people who believed in the policy. So again, he's taken a broadly popular policy and bungled it to the point where 3/4 of the people think he's not doing a good job of it. And all of this data was before the tragic events of yesterday. So I can only imagine that things are going to continue to slide for him, both overall and his handling of Afghanistan in particular. Some of this stuff, as Carl mentioned, credibility. I think Biden, one of the sort of tangential byproducts of this is that he's suffered a credibility issue because he's been telling the American people things that have been directly contradicted by members of his own administration, reports on the ground. There's been this people suggesting that he's doesn't know what's going on. He's detached from reality, whether that's on purpose or not, either one of those is not good for him overall. So polling for him, at least in the short term, is going to get worse. And yeah, it has Democrats nervous. I mean, it has real implications. I mean, you've got a recall of Gavin Newsom coming up in 2 weeks in California. You've got the Virginia and New Jersey governor's races 6 weeks after that. And then you look as this plays into the midterms. I don't know if I mentioned this on last week's program. We had a poll come out earlier this week in New Hampshire, right? Biden was ahead. His approval rating was 50-49 last month. This month, it's 44-54. So an 11-point negative swing for him. And you got to think Maggie Hassan, who's a Democrat incumbent running for re-election in a state that's going to be pretty darn competitive against maybe a top-tier candidate like Sununu, is looking at that and thinking, oh my gosh, please stop. If this continues, she could be in trouble. And Mark Kelly in Arizona, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, these are going to be very competitive races, very competitive states. And so to the extent that Biden's approval rating declines and does not recover because of what's happened in the last, 14 days. And again, we have a week, 2 more weeks of this, 3 more weeks of this. I mean, who knows how long this is going to last? It could be real problematic for Democrats, both in the short term and midterms.
Carl, last word. Do you see this as being sort of the legacy that Biden's going to live with, or do you think there's another chapter?
I assume there's going to be another chapter. We're talking about the midterm elections, 14, 15 months away. America could go through 2 or 3 more global crises by then. I mean, the world moves fast these days, and Americans have a short memory. So I don't know about that. But I guess, Andy, if you're giving me the last word, I'd like to switch from partisan politics back to something Joe Biden said yesterday from the East Room of the White House, and I found very moving. And I'll just read it to you. It's a short. He was talking about the Marines killed during that airlift, and he said, they are part of the bravest, most capable, and the most selfless military on the face of the earth. And they are a part of simply what I call the backbone of America. They are the spine of America, the best the country has to offer.
Well, leave it there. Tragic week. I want to thank Carl Cannon, Thom Shanker, Tom Bevan. We're usually here Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays in some form or fashion, so bookmark this podcast. Check back often. As always, I encourage you to go to Real Clear Politics and read one article from a writer or publication with whom you disagree. And we've been featuring in this podcast feed some of the podcasts and reporting from Real Clear Defense, particularly those on Afghanistan. I highly recommend you give those a listen if you want to get a deeper understanding of what is going on there. They've been talking to some of the leading experts, and it's been really good stuff. Thank you for listening. Until next time, for Real Clear Politics, I'm Andrew Walworth.